I was scrolling through some old science archives recently when I came across a 2009 paper titled The Neural Correlates of Religious and Non-Religious Belief. At the time, it was a massive deal. The author was Sam Harris, already a superstar of the new atheist movement, fresh off the success of The End of Faith. People treated this paper like it was the definitive smoking gun, the moment neuroscience finally proved that God was just a glitch in the brain's wiring. Watching old clips of Harris from that era, you can see the absolute confidence. He wasn't just a student finishing his PhD, he was a public intellectual using the weight of a brain scanner to settle a centuries-old theological debate. But then I started looking at how that same paper is discussed in labs today. The shift is jarring. What was once hailed as a breakthrough is now frequently dragged out as a what not to do example in neuroimaging. Critics point to tiny sample sizes, shaky interpretations, and methods that modern science is essentially left in the dumpster. It's become a classic case of science that didn't just age, it curdled. The immediate reaction from his critics is usually a smirk, a sense of, I told you so. As if the fast aging of the paper is proof of some kind of academic fraud or personal incompetence. But as I dug deeper into the actual history of fMRI, I realized something uncomfortable. If you look at the standards of 2007, Harris wasn't actually doing anything wrong. He was following the playbook. He was using the same tools as every other respected neuroscientist of the time. This creates a really strange paradox. If the science was standard for its time, why does this specific paper feel so much more embarrassing today than thousands of other forgotten studies from the same year? That question led me down a rabbit hole of how we use and abuse scientific authority. The real sin here might not be found in the data, but in what happens when we take a fragile, exploratory snapshot of the brain and try to freeze it into a permanent weapon for a culture war. Is Sam Harris actually to blame for his science falling apart, or did he just fall into a trap that many of us are still walking into today? And that paradox is exactly what we need to unpack today. This whole phenomenon of fast-aging science.
Right.
You see it in neuroscience, you see it in AI now. The headlines are screaming with certainty, but the actual data is, whispering maybe.
And it creates this incredible friction.
Yeah.
It really does. It's what happens when the science itself moves on, but the story that we've told ourselves about, that science is stuck in the past.
The cultural narrative gets frozen.
It gets frozen.
Yeah.
And that's a massive problem. It goes way beyond just Sam Harris or this one paper. The term we use for this is epistemic updating.
Okay.
In a perfect world, science is this beautiful, self-correcting loop. Mistakes get made, papers get published, someone else checks the work, and slowly, sometimes over decades, the errors are fixed.
It's messy, but it trends toward truth.
But that's the key part, right, over decades.
Exactly. The crisis begins when you take that slow, methodical academic process and you plug it straight into the high-speed machine of public opinion.
Because the public doesn't consume science in decades. We get it in, a tweet, a TED Talk, a headline that says, "Scientists find God spot in brain." Precisely. We want the answer now. And we treat these findings like they're statues carved in marble, these permanent monuments to truth.
When really they're what?
They're more like software in beta, especially in a frontier field like fMRI was back in 2009. These findings are they're full of bugs. And the ethical crisis happens when a public intellectual takes that beta software and sells it as the final, finished operating system for human morality.
I think we need to make this more concrete because it's easy to talk about in the abstract. I have a story that I think really gets at the human side of this. It's kind of a composite based on a few researchers from that time. Let's call him Dr. Harris.
Okay, let's walk through it.
So picture this. It's 2010. Neuroscience is having its big pop culture moment. Dr. Harris is on stage at one of those huge ideas festivals.
Yeah, dramatic lighting, sold-out theater. I can picture it.
Totally. And behind him on this enormous 40-foot screen is a high-res image of a brain. And there's this bright orange blob lit up in, say, the parietal lobe.
Ah, the classic blob on a brain slide.
Yeah.
That was the ultimate signal of authority back then. It meant this is real science.
It was everything. And Harris isn't just saying, hey, here's some interesting blood flow data. No, he's telling a story. He's pointing at the blob and saying, this is where your religious fundamentalism comes from. We have mapped the biology of belief.
Wow. That's a huge claim.
It's massive, and the audience is just eating it up. They're mesmerized. For them, he's not just a scientist. He's like a prophet of objectivity. He's giving them a biological permission slip to write off their ideological opponents as just, brain damaged or glitching.
You can feel that energy. It's an intoxicating feeling, both for him and for the audience.
It is. And that's the trap, isn't it? It's a positive reinforcement loop. The more certainty he projects, the louder the applause, the more books he sells. The incentives are all pushing him to overstate the case.
Completely aligned with overconfidence. There's no incentive for doubt in that room.
But now, let's fast forward. Cut to 14 years later. It's 2024. The stage lights are off. Dr. Aris is alone in his office, maybe late at night, and he's reading a new meta-analysis of the field.
Okay.
And this new paper, it's not based on 15 people in a scanner. It's based on thousands. The methods are light years ahead. And the paper is it's brutal.
How so?
It calls the methods he used statistically underpowered. His conclusions are labeled functionally obsolete. It basically says that the beautiful orange blob he showed to thousands of people was likely just noise. Just random fluctuations in blood flow that looked like a pattern because his sample size was too small to know the difference.
That is the absolute nightmare scenario for a public intellectual. Because now he has a choice to make, and it's an ethical choice, not just a scientific one.
Right. He can look over at his bookshelf and see his 3 best-selling books, all of them built on that old obsolete data. If he comes out and says the science has moved on,
he invalidates his own legacy. He has to go back to that audience, figuratively, and say, you know that map I sold you? The one you've been using to navigate your entire worldview for a decade? Turns out it's wrong. Sorry.
Who does that? Who has the courage to do that?
Almost no one. And this is where we run into a concept called epistemic inertia. It's like a giant boulder. The momentum of his previous claims is so powerful that stopping it, reversing it, requires a huge amount of energy, social capital.
Yeah, so what does he do?
Most people in Dr. Aris's position choose silence.
Yeah.
They just quietly stop talking about that old study. They pivot to a new topic. They hope nobody notices that the foundation of their public career has completely rotted away.
And it's that silence that really gets me. You know, we kind of expect politicians to dodge and weave, but we hold scientists to a different standard. We see them as these noble seekers of truth.
But the pressure to seem consistent, to never be wrong, often overrides that duty to update the public record.
It's because we confuse consistency with integrity.
That's it, exactly. In politics, if you change your mind, you're a flip-flopper. You're weak.
Yeah.
But in science, changing your mind because you have better evidence is the absolute definition of strength. It's the whole point.
I remember reading about the philosopher Hilary Putnam. His colleagues used to joke about him because he changed his mind so often on really big issues.
They did. They measured it in Hilaries, the unit of time between major changes in his philosophical position.
Right.
But Putnam wasn't embarrassed by it. He saw it as a sign of intellectual honesty. He argued that if the facts change and you don't change your mind, you're not being consistent, you're being dogmatic. You're valuing your ego over the truth.
But for a public figure like Dr. Aris or the real-life Sam Harris, there's this problem you call asymmetry. What is that?
It's the key difference between the academic world and the public sphere. In academia, if Harris's 2009 paper turns out to be flawed, what happens is it just quietly stops getting cited. It fades into obscurity. It's a quiet, dignified death.
It gets archived.
It gets archived. But out in the public sphere, that paper isn't a hypothesis. It's a weapon. It's been used in 1 million YouTube debates and forum arguments for 15 years. It has a life of its own.
So even when the science dies in the lab, the weapon is still out there.
It's still out there, circulating. And this is where the scientist incurs what I'd call a new responsibility. A duty to go out into the world and actively disarm the weapon they created, to stand up and say, I put this out there, it was the best I could do at the time, but we now know it's wrong, please stop using it.
And that almost never happens.
It's incredibly rare, because it feels like admitting you were incompetent from the start.
Which brings me back to the defense of Harris, because the paradox I mentioned in the beginning is that by the standards of his time, 2007, 2008, he wasn't actually being incompetent.
He wasn't, and this is a crucial point. We judge the past by the standards of the present, and that's often a mistake.
So if the science was so flawed, why did it get published in a good journal? Why did everyone accept it?
Because flawed is a retrospective judgment. In 2007, running an fMRI scanner was unbelievably expensive. You're talking about a multi-million-dollar machine that costs hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars an hour to operate.
So you couldn't just scan 1,000 people for your PhD project?
Absolutely not. A sample size of 15 or 20 people, that was the industry standard. It was seen as rigorous because it was the best anyone could do with the available technology and budget.
And the interpretation was different too, right? This idea of localization.
Totally. We were in this phase of thinking the brain was highly modular, like a Swiss Army knife. We were on a hunt for the fear center, the love center, the God center.
So you see a blob of activity in one spot.
And you assume that spot produces the experience. That's the part of the brain for that thing. We didn't fully grasp then that the brain is a massively interconnected network and that any complex thought lights up a whole constellation of regions.
So Harris was just following the playbook. Small sample, subtraction method, localization as conclusion.
He was following the playbook to the letter. So the real error wasn't in the scientific execution, given the time. The error, the sin, if you want to call it that, was the hubris of stabilization.
Stabilization?
Taking a fragile, exploratory, blurry Polaroid of a moving car and presenting it to the world as a perfect, permanent blueprint of the engine, the driver, and their destination. It was turning exploratory science into philosophical evidence.
And this pattern, it's not just history. This is the part that's so unsettling. This idea of fast fashion science is happening right now, maybe faster than ever.
It absolutely is. The cycle is accelerating.
I want to bring in another story here to illustrate that. Let's call her Sarah. Back in the late 2000s, right when Harris was publishing his paper, Sarah was a grad student in a neuroscience lab.
Okay.
She described spending her days in this windowless basement lab. The only sounds were the constant hum of the cooling fans and the rhythmic thumping sound of the gradient coils in the MRI machine.
I know that sounds well. It's the heartbeat of the lab.
Exactly. And she was analyzing fMRI data on religious belief, very similar to the kind of work Harris was doing. And she says she felt like she was on the absolute cutting edge of human knowledge.
Of course. It must have been an incredible feeling.
She remembers watching the data come in on the monitor, these little colorful voxels lighting up on a grayscale brain slice. And she honestly felt like she was looking at the soul of humanity.
That's a powerful phrase, the soul of humanity.
Intoxicating, right. But today, Sarah's not in neuroscience anymore. She left academia, and now she works as an AI ethics advisor. And she told me she gets this distinct feeling of nausea when she sits in meetings and listens to young AI engineers talk about large language models.
Because she recognizes the pattern.
She sees the exact same hubris, the same language. She hears these brilliant 25-year-old engineers looking at a chatbot's text output and saying things like, look, it understands morality, or it clearly has a theory of mind.
They're using prescriptive language, it understands, based on fleeting observational data patterns, just like she used to do with the blobs on the brain.
Exactly. And she has this horrifying realization that her old papers, the ones she now knows are technically flawed and obsolete, they actually provided the intellectual blueprint for this new generation's overconfidence.
That is a profound and deeply uncomfortable parallel. In both cases, you have a black box. In her day, it was the human brain. Today, it's the neural network of an AI. You poke it, you get a signal out of it, and then you project a massive philosophical narrative onto that signal.
We build entire ethical frameworks on what might just be a temporary trend in the data.
Fast fashion science. We're building our societal ethics on models and theories that might not survive next year's replication studies.
Let's get into the technical weeds for a minute, though. We keep saying these old studies were flawed. Beyond just the small sample size, what was actually wrong with the biology? I want to dig into the failure of the limbic marker hypothesis.
Yeah, this is super interesting. So the dominant theory in the mid-2000s, which was pushed by researchers like Azari and Slars, was that religious belief was fundamentally an emotional aberration.
An emotional glitch.
An emotional glitch. The hypothesis was that when someone has a profound religious experience, what's really happening is a misfiring of the limbic system, the primal emotional core of the brain. They even tried to link it to conditions like temporal lobe epilepsy, where people sometimes report mystical experiences during seizures.
Which fits the new atheist narrative perfectly. It frames belief not as a form of thought, but as an emotional spasm that overpowers rational thinking.
Precisely. The story was, religion is a bottom-up, primitive, emotional surge that hijacks the more evolved, rational parts of the brain.
But the data didn't hold up.
The data completely collapsed that theory. As the scanners got better, the resolution improved, the experimental controls got tighter. They looked for that limbic activity in isolation, and it just wasn't there.
So what did they find instead?
They found activity in places like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the precuneus.
Okay, you have to translate this for me.
Sure. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is basically the CEO of your brain. It's in charge of executive function, complex planning, abstract reasoning, working memory. It's the most rational part of the brain.
And the precuneus.
The precuneus is fascinating. It's deeply involved in self-reflection, episodic memory, and crucially, theory of mind.
The ability to imagine what someone else is thinking.
Exactly. The ability to model another consciousness. So when you put it all together, what does praying to a god look like in the brain? It doesn't look like an emotional spasm. It looks like a high-level cognitive task.
So it's more like having a conversation with an imaginary friend than having a seizure.
From a neural perspective, yes. The brain is engaging in a simulated social interaction. The subject is modeling a mind, God's mind. They're accessing memories like scriptures or traditions, and they're regulating their own internal state. It's a deeply cognitive act.
So the whole story of religious people are just emotional animals. It wasn't just dismissive, it was biologically wrong.
It was the opposite of what the better data showed. But there's an even bigger, more recent technical bombshell that's been dropped on the field. It's about the bold E signal itself.
Right. I was reading about this in Neuroscience News, and it honestly made me question the whole enterprise of fMRI.
It's the field's dirty laundry, for sure. We have to remember a fundamental fact. fMRI does not measure neural activity directly. It can't see neurons firing.
Right. It's not seeing electricity.
It's not. It's measuring something called the bold E signal. That stands for blood oxygen level dependent. The core assumption of the entire field for 30 years has been this. When neurons in a brain region fire a lot, they need more oxygen. So the circulatory system sends more oxygenated blood to that spot. More blood equals more thought.
That seems like a pretty logical assumption.
It seems logical, and most of the time it's probably true. But what recent, more sophisticated research has shown is that the coupling between the electrical activity of neurons and the plumbing of the blood flow, it's not a perfect one-to-one relationship.
It can come apart.
It can come apart. In some cases, it can even be inverse. You can have less neural activity, but more blood flow. But the real landmine here is a problem called vascular interference.
And this is related to aging.
Yes, primarily. As we get older, our blood vessels change. They get stiffer. Things like arteriosclerosis set in. The plumbing of our brain isn't the same at 70 as it was at 20.
Okay, I see where this is going. So if you're doing a study on, say, Alzheimer's, and you're comparing the brains of 70-year-olds to 20-year-olds.
The differences you see in blood flow, in the bold signal, might have nothing to do with their thinking or their memory. It might just be a map of their vascular health. You might be imaging the state of their arteries, not the state of their minds.
So if you scan a group of elderly nuns to study the neuroscience of prayer,
you might just be mapping the effects of their blood pressure medication. The source we looked at suggested that in some populations, especially older or clinical ones, up to 40% of the fMRI signal could be misinterpreted. It could just be vascular noise.
40%. That casts a shadow over thousands and thousands of papers on depression, on aging, and on religious belief in older subjects.
It's a huge confounding variable that the field is only now really grappling with.
And that explains why Sarah, our AI ethics advisor, is so spooked by the AI hype. She lived through this. She knows how easy it is to build these massive world-changing narratives on data that might literally just be vascular noise.
In AI, the noise is different, but the principle is the same. The noise is the bias in the training data. It's the weird artifacts of the architecture. We see a model produce a beautifully empathetic paragraph, and we say it's conscious.
Yeah.
But we might just be seeing a very sophisticated statistical mirror of all the empathetic text it was trained on, not a ghost in the machine.
It's the same error. What was the term you used? Reverse inference?
Exactly. Reverse inference. You see the result, a lit up brain region or a clever sentence, and you confidently infer the hidden internal cause. The parietal lobe lit up, therefore they are having a religious experience. No. That's a logical leap. The parietal lobe lights up for spatial navigation, for doing math, for a dozen other things. You can't work backward from the blob to the subjective state with that kind of certainty.
Okay. So this brings us to the final and maybe most frustrating piece of the puzzle, the zombie narrative.
Right.
We've established the science is shaky at best. We've established that the researchers themselves, like Sarah, know it's shaky. So why? Why do these stories refuse to die?
Because a good story is always stickier than a complicated data set.
I have one last story for you. It's about a high school philosophy teacher. Let's imagine him. He's maybe in his late 40s, teaches in a small town. He's been teaching the same curriculum for a decade.
Okay, I know this guy.
We all do. And every single year when he gets to the unit on faith versus reason, he pulls up a slide. And on that slide is the brain scan from that famous 2009 Sam Harris study.
Of course. Yeah. It's the perfect teaching tool. It's simple, it's visual, and it feels incredibly authoritative. Look, kids, science.
Exactly. He tells his students, look, science has now shown us that belief is just a chemical state in the brain. It's not a philosophical choice. It makes him feel rigorous. It makes the universe feel orderly and understandable.
It gives him an answer.
It gives him a simple answer. But then, this year, something different happens. A student raises her hand. She's one of the quiet, nerdy kids who read science blogs for fun. And she says, "Excuse me, sir, but didn't that study fail to replicate? I read about something called the replication crisis in neuroscience."
Boom. The challenge from the back of the room.
And the teacher is immediately on the defensive. He feels attacked. And not just his lesson plan, he feels personally attacked.
Because that study isn't just a slide in a PowerPoint deck for him. It's a load-bearing wall in his entire worldview.
Yes. So he kind of dismisses her, maybe makes a little joke about not believing everything you read on the internet, and he just keeps teaching the zombie narrative. The finding that is clinically dead in the lab but continues to walk the earth in our classrooms and our conversations.
That teacher's reaction is so incredibly human and so common. And it's happening against the backdrop of this huge replication crisis the student mentioned. It's not just neuroscience.
Right. This is a much bigger problem, like that famous social priming study.
Oh, the John Barr elderly walking study. A classic. The idea that if you had college students unscramble sentences with words like Florida, wrinkle, and bingo, they would then physically walk more slowly down the hallway afterward.
It was in every single psychology textbook for years.
It was gospel. And it has failed to replicate again and again and again. Or think about power posing. The Amy Cuddy idea that if you stand like Wonder Woman for 2 minutes, it will change your hormone levels and make you more successful.
I have to admit, I still do that one sometimes before a big meeting, just in case.
We all want it to be true. And that's the point. These ideas feel true. They're great stories. But the original science behind many of them was, we now know, likely the result of something called packing.
Right. That's the Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
It's the perfect analogy. You fire 100 shots at the side of a barn, then you walk up, find a random cluster of 3 bullet holes that are close together, and you draw a target around them. Then you declare yourself a sharpshooter.
So in science, that's running your data 60 different ways until you get a result that looks interesting.
Precisely. You torture the data until it confesses. You run dozens of different statistical tests, and you only publish the one that gives you a statistically significant result. You conveniently ignore the 59 tests that showed nothing.
So the high school teacher is, without knowing it, teaching a result that was probably hacked. But why is it so psychologically difficult for him to just say, you know what, student, you're right, I was wrong, let's look at the new data?
A few reasons. One is what we could call genealogical inertia. His identity as a rational, science-minded teacher is genealogically linked to those old studies. He built his intellectual house on that foundation. To admit the foundation is rotten feels like admitting his whole house, his identity, is worthless.
It's an attack on a sense of self.
It is. And then there's a cognitive bias called the myth-busting backfire effect. This one is really frustrating.
What's that?
There are studies where they show people a flyer that says myth versus fact. So, for example, myth. The flu shot can give you the flu. Fact. The flu shot cannot give you the flu. Then they test them a few days later, and what they find is that people often misremember the myth as being the facts.
Why?
Because all they remember is the connection between flu shot and getting the flu. The brain remembers the familiar association, not the negation. Belief is a brain glitch, is a simple, sticky, familiar sentence. Belief is a complex cognitive process involving the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the precuneus, the measurement of which is subject to vascular interference in bold fMRI signals. That was not sticky.
The simple lie outruns the complex truth every time.
Every single time.
Okay, so this feels a little bit hopeless. We're swimming in a sea of these zombie narratives. The headlines are often wrong. The old studies are debunked, but still being taught. And our own brains are wired to resist updating our beliefs. How do we navigate this? How do we find the truth in all this mess?
It's not hopeless, but it does require a totally new strategy for how we evaluate claims. One of the sources we looked at proposes a really useful concept. It's called asymmetric epistemic migration.
That is a serious mouthful. Can you break that down for us?
It sounds super academic, but the idea is actually very simple and practical. Think of a flock of birds or a school of fish. You don't figure out where they're going by tracking one single bird. That bird could be lost or just doing its own thing.
Right. You look at the direction the whole flock is moving. The vector matters more than the position of any one bird.
That's it, exactly. Now apply that to scientific consensus.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the Harris study. In 2009, you could find a small cluster of smart people, the birds, who were migrating toward that belief is a blob idea.
It was the new, exciting direction.
It was. But if you look at the period from, say, 2015 to today, the migration of experts has been overwhelmingly away from that idea. You do not see serious neuroscientists today migrating back to the simplistic localizationist view of 2009. They are all, as a flock, moving toward network theory, toward cognitive complexity, toward extreme caution about what fMRI can tell us.
So the rule of thumb should be, if you find a study that perfectly confirms what you already want to believe,
yes,
but you look up and you see that the entire flock of actual experts is flying in the opposite direction, you should probably trust the flock, not the single convenient study.
that is the essence of it. The truth is more likely to be found in the migration patterns of the people who do the work every day. If the smartest people in the room are consistently becoming less confident about a claim over time, you should probably lower your own confidence too.
That requires a tremendous amount of humility. It means you have to be willing to admit that being right isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a moving target.
It is. And that brings us full circle, back to the core mission of this deep dive. We started this whole conversation by asking if Sam Harris was to blame for his science falling apart. And I think the answer is, it's complicated. He wasn't a fraud.
No, he was following the rules of the game as it was played then.
Right. But he was a very fast mover who allowed his very early exploratory findings to be set in cultural concrete. And he fell into that trap of not publicly updating his claims with the same vigor he used to make them in the first place.
It really redefines what it means to be pro-science, doesn't it? I think for a lot of people, maybe like that high school teacher, being pro-science means you hold up a study or a textbook and you say, this is the law, the science is settled.
But that's not scientific thinking. That's actually religious thinking wearing a lab coat. True science is pro-revision. It's the active, sometimes painful willingness to destroy your own most cherished maps. It's Sarah realizing her life's work was probably flawed and having the integrity to pivot to ethics. It's the uncomfortable three-word sentence that is the hallmark of all true knowledge. I don't know.
It's funny, we spend so much of our time judging public intellectuals by the arguments they win or who has the slickest data point to dunk on their opponents in a debate. We treat them like intellectual gladiators. But after this conversation, I feel like we're using the wrong metric entirely.
How do you mean?
We spend so much time judging public intellectuals by the arguments they win or the data they cite, but perhaps we're looking at the wrong metric. Maybe the true measure of a thinker's worth isn't found in the paper that launched their career, but in their willingness to burn their own best-selling maps when the territory shifts beneath their feet.